Clarence Dalton stared at the rusted steel wall, his eyes fixed on a name buried beneath the dust. Nightshade Echo. It wasn't just an unfinished evacuation order. It was the code name for the woman he once loved, and the promise he had never kept. Weeks earlier, a group of young explorers had stumbled upon an old steel door deep in the forests of Wyoming. They thought it was just another abandoned Cold War site. They were wrong. What they found was a forgotten underground bunker, sealed for decades, untouched by time. Jason whispered into the camera, "This isn't just a bunker. This is a command center, frozen in time." And on the far wall, beneath layers of decay, were hundreds of military orders, left incomplete. They didn't know it yet, but they had just uncovered a part of history that was never meant to be found. During the height of the Cold War, fear didn't live in the streets. It lived in silence, in codes, in contingency plans written in rooms with no windows. One of the United States' most secretive military strategies at the time was a program called Continuity of Command, a network of hidden underground bunkers designed to preserve military leadership in the event of a nuclear war. These were not your typical fallout shelters. They were fortified command centers, built deep underground, isolated from radio interference, EMP blasts, and foreign surveillance. One of the most classified among them was Site Echo 9. There are no official maps that show its location, no budget reports, no military photographs. It was built in complete darkness, figuratively and literally, under the guise of civilian infrastructure. Even the construction orders were signed under false names, passed through dummy contractors, and buried in mountains of decoy paperwork. What little is known now has come from former defense analysts and aging veterans who have begun to speak out, carefully and with hesitation. They refer to sites like Echo 9 as shadow sites, facilities that technically didn't exist but were fully operational and combat-ready. Site Echo 9 was constructed somewhere in the remote mountain regions of Wyoming at a depth of approximately 90 feet underground. The base was self-contained, with a generator system powered by dual-fuel turbines, internal oxygen recycling, water purification, and blast doors capable of withstanding a 50-kiloton nuclear strike. Its purpose was singular: to serve as a last resort command center for launching retaliatory strikes, maintaining satellite communications, and coordinating Allied defense efforts in case the U.S. mainland was hit. But Echo 9 was different. According to internal whispers, Echo 9 was not only a fallback operations post, it was also a classified coordination node for covert evacuations and intelligence extractions. That included high-value personnel, embedded agents, and civilian assets operating under deep cover. Then in the early morning hours of September 5, 1971, Echo 9 received a signal. It wasn't a drill. The lights came on. The radios buzzed to life. Staff scrambled into action. Personnel were brought in from sleeper rotations. One message was repeated through multiple encrypted channels. Stand by for DEFCON 1 protocols. Operators at Echo 9 began uploading targeting data. Teams readied the strike response plans. A printed list of evac orders was sealed and handed to the commanding officer. And then, 90 seconds before execution, everything stopped. A final override came through. It wasn't coded. It came through voice channel, a voice known to many, direct from DC. The order was simple. All operations, stand down. Disengage immediately. This channel is now closed. No explanation, no debrief, no classification code, just silence. Within days, the bunker was decommissioned. Power was cut. The staff reassigned, transferred, or, in some cases, mysteriously discharged. All mentions of Echo 9 were scrubbed. Even internally, it became a ghost, a memory no one was allowed to acknowledge. Some say the site was dismantled. Others claim it was simply sealed and forgotten, not because of what it almost did, but because of what it almost revealed. And now, decades later, Jason and his team had walked straight into it. The first thing that struck them was the silence. Deep, pressing, unnatural. Not just the absence of sound, but the weight of it. Like whatever had once moved through this place had been ordered to stop, forever. Jason and his team, Lena, Marcus, and Troy, stepped cautiously through the narrow passage that led from the steel entrance door into the main hallway. Their boots echoed on the concrete floor, covered in dust so thick it softened every step, like walking through history. The bunker smelled of old metal, mildew, and something else. The dry, sterile scent of a place untouched by air for decades. A heavy blast door stood half open ahead, bent at the hinges, revealing a dim corridor beyond. On the wall beside it, faded paint stenciled in block letters read, Communications. Alpha Section. Inside, they found what was once the primary comms room. The equipment was outdated by at least half a century, but mostly intact. Radios lined the walls, knobs twisted halfway, wires trailing like dried vines. A dusty world map stretched across the far side, pinned with colored flags and handwritten notes. Jason leaned in and saw names of places he'd only ever read about in history books. Berlin, Hanoi, Odessa. Some flags had been crossed out, others circled in red. Lena opened one of the drawers under the radio console and found a stack of papers, decoded message transcripts and tactical memos. Some were stamped top secret, eyes only, dated between 1969 and 1971. But what caught everyone's attention was what sat on a desk in the back corner of the room, an old military typewriter, still loaded with a sheet of thin, yellowed carbon paper. Marcus gently rotated the roller. A line of text emerged, faint but legible. Operation Backfire. Hold beneath that, one more line had been typed. Authorization pending. Echo 9 command, Tier 4 clearance. Jason stared at it, expression unreadable. They were ready to launch something, he said quietly. And then, someone told them to wait. They moved deeper into the facility. The central command room was surprisingly intact. The walls were reinforced with thick steel plates. Control consoles, though aged and dark, were still aligned in perfect rows. Chairs hadn't been overturned. There was no evidence of panic. It was as if everyone had simply walked away. In the far corner, a faint blue light glowed softly behind a mesh panel. Lena leaned in. That's a thermogenerator, she said. Radioisotope type. Low power, but that's why the backup systems still work. The moment felt surreal. A forgotten command center, 90 feet underground, still pulsing faintly with life after half a century. Then they saw it. On the far wall, opposite the main console, was a dark steel panel, about 8 feet wide, bolted directly into the concrete. Rows of weathered documents were clipped to it in a grid formation. There were no labels, no signs. But Jason knew immediately. This is it. This is where they kept the orders. They stepped closer. Each paper was stamped with an operation name, a time, and a location. Most were typed, some handwritten, some were sealed with red wax. Every one of them was unfinished. Jason began to read the titles aloud. Activate Blackwing Protocol, Extract Civilian Asset, Nightshade Echo, Deploy SEAL Unit to Black Sea Coast, Stage Intercept, Baltic Line, Initiate Signal Chain Bravo. None of them were marked as complete. Then they noticed something else. Several of the orders had been crossed out in thick red ink, messy, fast, like someone had done it under pressure. Next to them, in shaky handwriting, was a note repeated more than once. Mission canceled. Await debrief. The room fell silent again. Marcus turned slowly. This wasn't some random outpost. This place was active, and it got shut down fast. Lena knelt near the base of the wall and found a small, rusted lockbox half covered in dust. Inside were laminated protocol cards, each labeled in military code. One read, SEAL Team, Deploy Zulu Coastline. Another, Civilian Extraction, Nightshade Echo. She looked up. They weren't just preparing for war, she said. They were preparing to pull someone out. Someone important. Jason didn't say anything. He was focused on the wall, his flashlight trained on the words Nightshade Echo. The name had clearly been typed, not handwritten. It was an official part of the order. It had been ready, and yet it had never happened. They had found no records of cancellation, no notes of confirmation, no signed debrief logs. Only that single handwritten message, await debrief. But no one ever came back. No one ever finished what was started. The wall had been waiting, silently, for over 50 years. And now finally someone was listening. After uploading a few carefully edited photos of the bunker, Jason posted the story on a Cold War history forum. He didn't share the exact location, only the details they had seen, the documents found, and the haunting phrase stamped across so many pages. Mission canceled. Await debrief. The post barely stayed up a day before it exploded in activity. Dozens of comments poured in. Theories, speculation, some clearly delusional. But among the flood of noise, one direct message stood out. It was from a user named Amelia Reed. Her message was short but chilling. My grandfather used to speak about a place called Echo 9. Only once. But he stopped mid-sentence and left the room. I think you should meet him. They arranged the visit quietly. Jason, Lena, and Marcus drove down to a remote patch of land in western Colorado, where Amelia met them at the gate of an old ranch house surrounded by tall grass and rusted fence wire. The home looked forgotten by time, much like the bunker, but it stood firm against the wind, as if holding its breath for decades. Inside, Clarence Dalton, age 87, waited. He didn't stand to greet them. He simply looked up from a worn leather chair, his eyes sharp beneath a thick pair of glasses. Though age had bowed his back and softened his voice, there was a quiet weight about him, like someone who had spent a lifetime keeping something locked deep inside. Amelia introduced them. Jason explained why they'd come and showed Clarence the photo, the steel wall, the clipped orders, and especially the line that read, "Extract civilian asset, Nightshade Echo." Clarence stared at it for a long time. Minutes passed in silence. No one dared interrupt. Then, barely audible, he whispered, "That wall, I was ordered to forget it ever existed." His hands trembled slightly as he set the photo down on the armrest. His eyes didn't leave the image. Echo 9 wasn't like the other sites. It was a Tier 4 response station. Small crew, high-level clearance. We weren't told where we were going, only that we were being activated for a real threat. Not a drill. He took a breath. It was September 5th, 1971. We received DEFCON 1 readiness. I was on comms duty. My job was to authenticate strike orders and input transmission sequences. And that morning, we got them. Jason leaned forward. "You got real launch orders?" Clarence nodded. "They came encoded. Full authorization. Tier 1 response. We began prepping target sets. I typed the final line of execution. My hand was on the key. Then, the voice came through. Not encrypted, not via comms. Straight voice line. I recognized it. We all did. It was someone from the White House. I won't say who, but they said, 'All operations, stand down, disengage immediately. This channel is now closed.' Then they cut the line." Marcus said quietly, 90 seconds before launch?" Clarence nodded. "Maybe less." He looked out the window for a long time, as if what he was seeing wasn't in the present anymore. We waited for follow-up, a debrief, some kind of explanation. It never came. The next day, orders came in to lock the facility, seal the documents, and disband the team. No medals, no record. We signed paperwork that stripped our clearance and barred us from ever speaking of what happened. They dissolved us like we never existed. Lena asked gently, "Did anyone ever break that silence?" Clarence hesitated. "One man tried. He disappeared a year later. Car accident. No investigation." He reached into a nearby drawer and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed at the corners. Inside was a patch, dark green cloth, stitched with a symbol none of them had seen before, a lightning bolt piercing a circle of stars. "This was Echo 9's insignia," Clarence said. "It was never registered, worn under the uniform, never displayed publicly. No one outside the station would recognize it." Jason turned the photo back toward Clarence and pointed at the line again. "Nightshade Echo." The old man's face changed, softer now, his jaw clenched slightly. That wasn't a mission. That was a person. She was an asset embedded in the Eastern Bloc. Civilian cover, deep ties, intel worth entire operations. But she was more than that. She was someone I loved. Before I was reassigned, before the silence. We were supposed to extract her during Operation Backfire. He paused. That's why I stayed at Echo 9. I wasn't just there to transmit orders. I stayed behind to make sure hers went through. Jason asked, but the order was never carried out? Clarence shook his head. They canceled everything, every name, every mission, hers included, and I was told to act like she never existed, that what we had never happened. Silence returned to the room, and for the first time in 50 years, Clarence Dalton finally looked someone in the eye and remembered out loud. The room had fallen into a long, aching silence. Outside, the Colorado wind brushed against the old wooden walls of Clarence Dalton's home, but no one in the room moved. The only sound came from the slow ticking of a mantel clock, a quiet reminder of time, ever moving, even when memories refused to. Clarence leaned forward, slowly and carefully, as if his body still obeyed a military rhythm, even after all these years. Jason reached into his backpack and pulled out a clearer printout of one of the photos from the wall. It showed a clipped order halfway down the third column. The typewritten line, although faded, was legible. Nightshade Echo, Civilian Evac Protocol, SHAS Tier 2 Priority, Secure and Extract by 05 Zulu. Clarence didn't need to read it again. He had memorized those words the moment he first saw them 5 decades ago. That, he said quietly, was her. Jason glanced up. Her? Clarence nodded. His voice was steadier now, but lower, like each word cost something to say. Lena Whitmore, born in Prague, 1938, half American by blood, fluent in 5 languages, embedded as a translator during the height of the Soviet occupation. But she wasn't just translating, she was passing information, critical information, troop movements, satellite data, infiltration routes. She was one of ours, but she was never in uniform. Lena, the young woman from Jason's crew, looked stunned. She shared my name? Clarence gave a half smile. Lena was a popular name in her generation, but yours just brought it back sharper. He continued. We met in Berlin. I was stationed there before Echo 9. She passed herself off as a liaison between American diplomats and Eastern Bloc translators. I was warned not to get too close, but that kind of warning comes too late once you've already looked someone in the eye. He paused and glanced down at the floor. When she was burned, compromised, her identity wasn't confirmed, but her extraction protocol was activated anyway. It was passed through Echo 9 for execution. That's how it ended up on the wall. Jason spoke gently, but the mission never happened. Clarence nodded. I stayed on duty past my rotation because I wanted to see the order confirmed. I sat in the comms room, waiting for clearance to transmit. The evacuation team was prepped. Everything was aligned, and then he made a soft, snapping gesture with his fingers. It all got erased, canceled. No explanation, no recovery, and I stood down. I obeyed. He inhaled deeply, hands now clenched slightly. For years, I told myself that maybe she got out some other way, that maybe she never needed us. But I knew better. The moment I saw the line drawn through her name, the red ink, the word canceled, I knew they had left her behind. Amelia placed a hand gently on her grandfather's shoulder, but he didn't seem to feel it. His eyes were somewhere else, still fixed on the photo, still locked in that moment. That wall, Clarence whispered, holds my greatest failure. Not because I didn't act, but because I obeyed. The words hit hard. Jason didn't respond. None of them did. It wasn't the kind of statement you followed up. It wasn't regret. It was confession. One that had waited too long for air. Clarence turned to Jason. You said it's still there? The wall? Jason nodded. It's untouched. We didn't take anything. Just photos. We thought it wasn't ours to remove. Clarence gave a slow, grateful nod. Good, it shouldn't be. Let it stay there. Let someone else see it. Let it mean something. Then after a long pause, he added quietly, I was told to forget her, that the mission never existed, that she never existed. But the wall remembered. You found it. That means something. For the first time, Jason realized something deeper about the bunker, about Echo 9, about the wall. It hadn't just been a command center. It had been a grave marker, not for bodies, but for unfinished decisions, for names that were erased from history without ceremony. That night, they left Clarence's home without saying much more. The air was heavy. There was nothing more to say. But Lena, Jason's Lena, turned to him as they got back into the car and whispered, "We have to go back, don't we?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, we do." Jason hesitated for days before posting the footage. He had hours of material, from the moment they cracked open the steel door to the grainy footage of the wall, the clipped orders, the phrase "Nightshade Echo" lingering in the air like smoke. Every frame was haunting. Every second pulsed with something heavier than just exploration. It was evidence of something real, something long buried. He trimmed the footage carefully, removing anything that might reveal the location or specific route they took. He added no background music, no dramatic commentary, just a simple title, Echo 9, The Forgotten Bunker. And he hit upload. Within 24 hours, the video had over 3 million views. Comments flooded in. At first, the usual skeptics and internet thrill seekers. But then, something shifted. Veterans began chiming in. Men in their 70s and 80s left cryptic messages. Some mentioned shadow sites. Others referenced continuity protocols. One said simply, "I signed an oath not to talk about this, but I remember that wall." The story was picked up by fringe history bloggers, then mainstream military forums, and within days it reached national news. That's when the government stepped in. Within 72 hours of the video going viral, Jason received an official notice. The area had been declared federal property, now listed under the Department of Energy. Heavily redacted orders followed: restricted airspace, access closures, and signs posted at all visible trailheads leading into the forest. Satellite images began to blur out the region on mapping services. To the outside world, it had become off-limits for environmental testing. Jason and his team kept quiet. They had expected this. But what they didn't expect was the flood of personal messages from veterans, ex-intelligence personnel, and retired contractors. Many didn't give names, but their stories were eerily similar. One man said he was stationed in an unnamed mountain facility in 1971 and remembered orders that came in, then vanished. Another recalled receiving coded evac protocols for a mission that was canceled while en route. It wasn't just a bunker. Echo 9 had echoes. Amid the growing storm, one name stood out. Greg Tennyson, a retired military journalist and former embedded correspondent in Vietnam, had been following the story closely. Now in his early 60s, he had turned to podcasting. And with Jason's permission, he launched a special investigative series titled The Orders That Vanished. In the first episode, Greg reviewed the public video, added historical context, and posed the question, how many missions were erased from history not because they failed, but because they were never allowed to succeed? By episode 2, he brought in military historians, satellite analysts, and encryption experts. But for episode 3, he wanted something more. He wanted a witness, and there was only one man who had seen it all. Greg reached out to Clarence Dalton. At first, Clarence declined, but then Jason called him personally and simply said, "People are listening now." Clarence agreed. The interview was recorded at his home. No cameras, just microphones, and Greg's calm, precise voice. Clarence spoke slowly, deliberately, a man not used to being heard. He recounted the morning of September 5th, 1971. The order, the override, the cancellation, the silence that followed. He spoke of Lena Whitmore, codenamed Nightshade Echo, and how she was never recovered. "I don't know if she survived. I don't know if the mission would have made a difference. But I know this. The order was real. She was real. And someone, somewhere, decided she wasn't worth saving." The episode aired under the title, The Name on the Wall. It became the most downloaded podcast episode that month. Public interest surged. Congressional aides began quietly requesting transcripts. Retired officers left anonymous voicemails for Greg's team. The story had moved beyond urban legend. It had entered historical pressure. And yet, through it all, the government said nothing. Not a denial, not a statement, just silence. But Clarence had finally spoken, and that changed everything. 1 month after the interview aired, Clarence Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep. There was no headline, No national moment of silence, just a short obituary in the local Colorado paper and a funeral attended by fewer than a dozen people, most of them family or neighbors too old to travel far. Jason and Lena drove up quietly, keeping a respectful distance. They didn't bring cameras, didn't post anything. This wasn't part of the story anymore. This was the end of it. Amelia met them at the small church cemetery tucked against the hills. Her eyes were tired but calm, the kind of calm that only comes after someone has been released from carrying something heavy for too long. After the service, she approached Jason with a folded letter in her hand. The envelope was worn, sealed with an old piece of string. On the back it simply said, "For someone who finds the wall." Amelia explained that she had discovered it hidden behind the framed portrait of her grandmother, Lena Whitmore, the one that always sat untouched on Clarence's bookshelf. For years, no one had dared to move it. Inside the envelope was a short note, handwritten in tight, deliberate cursive. "If you see the wall again, tell Lena I waited. I waited until I couldn't anymore. But I remembered, and I didn't let them erase her." Jason read it in silence. Then he folded the letter again, slower than necessary, and slipped it back into the envelope as if handling something sacred. There was nothing more to be said. A few weeks later, Jason and his team made one last trip to the bunker. Getting in was harder now. The path had been barricaded by federal fencing, and warning signs were posted every few yards. But they found a way around it. They always did. When they reached the steel entrance of Echo 9, it was just as they had left it. Heavy, silent, and sunken into the earth like a wound time refused to close. They brought no gear that day, no cameras, no lights. Just a flat wooden board, sealed in plastic, with laser-etched replicas of the military orders they had once found on the wall. They had copied each line by hand, retyped every canceled order, every scratched-out name. At the top, they engraved a final line: "For those who were left behind, and those who remembered." They mounted it just inside the entrance, bolted it into the concrete where sunlight barely reached. Then they stood in silence. It wasn't about closure. Not really. History rarely gives closure to people like Clarence. People whose stories never made it into textbooks, whose love stories were cut short by classified memos and erased timelines. But now there was something real, something permanent. Jason looked up at the steel frame of the door and whispered, "You weren't erased." And in that moment, Echo 9 wasn't just a Cold War bunker. It was a memorial. Not for victory, but for memory itself. Not every hero ends up in a book. Some are never photographed, never interviewed, never decorated. They were never supposed to be remembered because the missions they carried and the people they protected were never meant to exist in the first place. But they did. They existed in silence, in service, in loyalty that defied explanation, in bunkers with no names, behind doors sealed with orders that were typed but never carried out, and on walls like the one in Echo 9, cold steel that held the weight of decisions no one wanted to acknowledge. Clarence Dalton was one of those men. He didn't save the world. He didn't defy the chain of command. He didn't launch missiles or storm enemy lines. He simply remembered. And that, in a world so quick to forget, is its own kind of courage. We often think of history as something fixed, complete, sealed in museums, written by victors. But history is also made up of what was buried, what was denied, what was silenced. There are men and women whose names never made it into records because they were erased before the ink could dry. There are missions that ended before they began, orders canceled at the last second, walls of unfinished intent. And sometimes all it takes to uncover them is a broken lock, a rusted door, and someone willing to ask, "What happened here?" Echo 9 is just one bunker, one wall, one name. But how many more are out there? How many other Nightshade Echoes were left behind? How many Clarences waited in silence, believing they were the last ones who remembered? We may never find them all, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to keep looking, to ask the questions no one's dared to ask, and to carry the stories that were never meant to be told. Not because they glorify war, but because they honor something deeper. Loyalty without recognition, duty without reward, and love that endures even when forgotten. So the next time you pass a rusted door in the woods, or hear an old man whisper a name no one else recalls, don't look away. You might be closer to a forgotten truth than you realize. Thank you for listening to this journey. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing the stories that history almost forgot. But that still matter today, because some walls shouldn't stay buried, and some names deserve to be remembered.